Welcome to my talk on Diego Rivera, Painting History, Anachronistic Appropriation and History Painting, a sardined picture plane where traumas are endlessly replayed under a modernist global tact. So this series of talks about muralism is coming off of a group of previous talks for the class on art history that dealt with 1600 BC and forwards with Mesoamerica, the Olmecs, Teotihuacan, and now we're in the 20s and the 30s, and we're talking about muralism and Diego Rivera specifically. And Diego Rivera is an excellent case study for thinking about, diving into, and dealing with what art history is and what it means to look at art objects that are from another time and another culture and have meaning that is quite fickle, for lack of a better word, right? That changes with time and with perspective. And so if you're used to kind of an iconographic reading of art, this is going to be really surprising and should be fun. I've had students say, well, if we're not going to talk about iconography, what are we going to talk about? And so Diego Rivera is an excellent place for that because normally he's the kind of painter that has so many stories and figures and characters that one might assume that discussing who this gentleman is in this painting and what this tree is and going through that story might be a way to unravel the meaning and profundity of the work and the time and the culture that it's made from. But there are several other art historical methodologies for opening up and relating to the art objects of this world. There's a more formalist method. There's a social art history. There's ways of talking about perspective and the picture plane and culture in terms of a philosophical point of view that can be really, really wonderful and rich. So I'm just going to go through the overarching topics that I'm going to try to hit on throughout these talks on Diego Rivera. I'm going to go through the legacy of painting of New Spain. So there was an academy in Mexico City called the San Carlos Academy, and this was part of the viceroyalty of Spain. Spain occupied and dominated Mexican people and culture for 300 years before the Mexican Empire finally was able to break free. And then you had the Mexican Revolution after 30 years of Porfirio Diaz's rule. And so the San Carlos Academy was during the time of Porfirio Diaz and is part of this colonial 300-year legacy of Spanish painters teaching and painting in Mexico and bringing over styles and tutelage from Europe and Spain. And Spain had an obsession with the French history painting and with the idea of neoclassicism and that the Romans and the Greeks have the truth of this world. So that whole trajectory follows through to this academy in Mexico City where Diego Rivera studied. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit. And then I'm going to talk about the fact that Diego Rivera was state sponsored and won awards in Mexico, was state sponsored by the Mexican government to study in Europe. And I'm going to talk about his influences from many of these paintings and drawings that I also drew from, the Giotto works, the Byzantium works, and I'm going to show slides of those works and his drawings and how they relate to his work. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about his time in Paris and his appropriation of those models from Picasso and his Cubist work and kind of what he inherited from the European context that was existing at that time before he returned to Mexico to paint the murals. All of this happened before he made the murals that are part of the nation building of of Mexico in the 20s and 30s. And then I'm going to talk about his self-proclaimed icon, who is Posada, who is this incredible graphic artist that produced works in newspapers and publications, and the idea of art for the people, which is really tied into muralism and a socialist or communist type art form that Diego and the other muralists discussed and talked about, and thought of their work as being positioned within a kind of a social art form, right? A communist art form was definitely on the horizon during that time. And so a artist for the people who made prints that were accessible for everybody, that had political context and satire, and were quite cutting, and are part of that kind of that history of caricature. Someone like Posada was clearly very important. So I'll show several works of Posada's as well, and how Diego might have dealt with those as an artist, figuring out how he wanted to represent himself and his culture during this time period. And I talk about wall painting versus easel painting a little bit in this time period, and that's kind of repeating what I just said, but it's like the idea of wall painting, it can't be sold, right? This is a specific way of making art that might be aggressive towards capitalist notions of art as an investment that can be traded and accrue wealth. So all of that is laced in to this talk about Diego Rivera. Now, what I want to do is show a couple questions that students can ask themselves and mull over, and some of them are quite complex, so I want to go over them kind of slowly, and they're introductions to my overarching umbrella for these talks. So what do you think of when you think of Mexican muralism? When you think of Diego Rivera, what comes to mind? And whatever those thoughts are, if they are biographical in nature, if they are about kind of who he was, or I don't know, his family life or his identity, does that biographical information cloud, obstruct, or distract meaning in an artwork, or does it add to the meaning of the artwork? So part of what I'm talking about here is these different art historical methodologies, and what they put pressure on, or how they reveal certain aspects of an artwork. And so the biographical is a very classic old school way of doing art history that has to do with talking about the artist's life, what they said about their work, their letters, their diaries, and that has a specific pace to it in terms of understanding an artwork. So when do you stop paying attention or leave the artwork? So this is a really important question. So you look at an artwork and then you say, oh, I get it, and you walk on to the next one. Or you say, oh, I like that, I want it, and then you put it in your bag and you take it away. Or I don't like that, next one. Or let's say you're of the mind, I don't like that. Why don't I like that? What does that say about me? Okay, so how quickly do you leave? What is the pace of how quickly you leave the experience of an artwork? I think it's a really important question when we're dealing with art history, is when we're going to leave the visual experience and start taking the thing apart, kind of in terms of what its meaning and profundity could be. And then how do you judge a work of art? How do you assess how important it is? What are your guidelines? Like, it has to have a certain level of craft and skill. It has to speak to its time. It has to be part of a history. There's all kinds of rules that each culture and time period and person individually comes up with for what has merit. And so just because you have that position and idea currently doesn't mean that that's what existed when the thing was made. And so I want us to be sensitive about that. And then if we move on to the idea of a capitalist or a socialist art or revolutionary art, these are ideas that I touched on with the earlier set of slides, but I want us to really think about, and maybe specifically in terms of a painting, a wall painting, what is art that's social, that's attached to some economic power regime, some specificity of governance, right? What is a a capitalist type artwork? What does that even mean? What is a socialist artwork? And then another question would be, is art only for the aristocratic and the educated? So is it just something that's for people who are educated, and it's something that people who have not been to university cannot understand? Is it something that should remain in some kind of ivory tower? Or is there a possibility for an art that can be understood by everybody? Is that even a notion to that someone might believe in, that something can be understood by everybody, a kind of leveling of difference by some kind of incredible aesthetic experience? So this is another topic of art history. And then on a more complex level that I want to throw out there, even if you're not ready to deal with this, or you don't want to go too far into the intellectual qualities of art history, it's just worth it to have it in the background as a hum, maybe, which is, we're dealing with nation building with Mexico. We're dealing with Mexico finding its identity, and there's a lot of powers influencing the government and the people at this time. And it's a time when there's a definition of culture occurring. And this is why there is so much pressure on defining who the indigenous cultures were and how to express themselves in Mexico during this time. And for that reason, Diego Rivera is representing indigenous culture in a specific way, because this is a time when Mexico is trying to understand how it associates with its European history. So I just want to throw that out there as part of the meaning of the works. And similar things exist in Senegal, West Africa, when Leopold Senghor was president there, and there was this influx of impressionist French painting ideas. And at the same time, you have a nation defining itself. And so this happens with post-colonial moments in history, and it has reverberations in the artwork that is made during that time that makes it a very complex moment to talk about. And then finally, there's two last points that I'd like to discover during these talks, which is how does artwork deal with us when we're experiencing it? And so artwork has a way of reflecting ourselves back on ourselves. It has a way of presenting our identities to ourselves. So if it's saying that we're strong and independent and great workers, and we're getting those representations in imagery in the world around us, we're getting that feedback. That's a kind of identity formation occurring. And depending on how those images are proliferated and represented, our identities are being coerced in different ways. Not in any kind of paranoid mentality. I'm just saying that there are ideologies inherent in representations. And so part of dealing with the Diego Rivera work is dealing with how identity is created through representation. And then lastly, what I want to talk about is the idea of anachronistic appropriation. So all I mean by that is existing in a global time where there's this global network of histories and cultures that can steal from each other and can use different models to represent things that are intimate and important to them. So Diego Rivera had the ability to study and understand modes of representation within an Italian fresco style from the Renaissance, and to apply indigenous Mexican stories to that model and paint with that model. So that is a kind of borrowing that is incredibly intelligent and complicated to talk about. And so I want to mention that idea of appropriation and appropriating, taking on another culture's mode to deal with one's own, and what kind of accent, I say, or vestige of the previous encounter still exists or is there to be reckoned with, right? Like if you dress something up in a style, it's hard to completely remove the original intention, I guess, behind those modes of representation being invented. So that's a mouthful. It's an image heavy series of talks, but I need to get all of that kind of intellectual groundwork laid so that we can really appreciate how complex these works are. So now I'm just going to show a couple more slides that deal with the basic introduction to Diego Rivera. So on the left, you have Posadas, one of his amazing prints. Often they're with skulls and skeletons. And on the right, you have a Alameda Hotel mural from 1947. This is one of Diego Rivera's very late works. And I'm just showing the idea that comes from modernism of painting through the end in a way. And the inevitable, exhaustive political deluge of oppression specific to the length of the duration of the Mexican Revolution and that nation's history is something that it seems like when you look at Diego's paintings is something that he keeps painting through, and he keeps retelling and attempting to retell the whole story of this history in one painting. And over again, you see him kind of collecting that history and repainting this this collapse and formation of a country. And so I'm talking about that expression of pain and suffering in painting about a cycle historically, and Posada has that cutting quality to his social critique in his prints as well. And then we have this history painting enterprise that Diego is really involved in. So on the right, you have Felix Parra, who is a teacher of Diego Rivera's at the San Carlos Academy. And on the right, you have his depiction of Hernan Cortez slaughtering indigenous people of Mexico, and you have his soldiers there. And on the left, you have the partition of land in the Great Chapingo mural series from 1925. So you have about 50 years apart here, and these are different ways of telling a story. And Diego is part of a lineage of history painting, of telling complex historical painting stories with painting, and it comes from Spain and France, as well as any culture that's telling a story about their past, right? But we're talking about the nature of the picture plane and painting in terms of telling a story and how painting might lend itself to that. So I write here, what kind of viewer do each of these paintings technology imply? Picture as memory, picture as imagining other than what we have. How do they make the past now? What is it to retell history? Historicity. For example, how are the different renditions of picture plane, which is a type of painting technology, indicative of an audience, of an ideology of an audience? So, right, where are we positioned in different kinds of history painting? So on the right, there's the idea of the voyeur. We're looking at a window. We're removed to some degree. We're seeing something after the fact. There's a certain nostalgia. There's a whole idea about history and sadness and tragedy going on. You even have these kind of these how do you say it, like remnants of ruins and ruin, like the way we think about the Greeks and Romans, and that kind of idea of ruins being represented with the Aztec buildings in the background. But we bring that all to bear when we look at Diego's history painting, and this is a very different kind of technology of telling a story. We have many people kind of packed into this space. We have a tighter picture plane. We have more of an acceptance of abstraction with the hills and the desert in the background. There's a different kind of way that we are insinuated as viewers, the way that we can be a part of this. How much can we be a part of this story that is being told? Why is it being represented in the way that it is. So that's what I'm going to try to get at with history painting and painting technologies such as the picture plane. And then I'm just talking about different reactions to the horrors of our world and history repeating itself and the irony of repetition. So this talks a little bit about what I've already talked about, and the idea the picture plane is fully crowded in Diego Rivera's paintings, and a collage of history and people and politics. And again, painting through a dream of totality and revolution for the working class, a kind of history painting. On the right, you have Hannah Hock, this kind of post-World War Dadaist, post-World War One, who does a collage, right? We're talking about early collage images with reproductions pasted on paper, and they have a similar reading of a kind of cacophony psychology. So I'm going to bring that up a little bit. There's this moment that's hard to understand from outside of reading a lot about it and thinking about it, where there's certain revolutions in Mexican painting that, for example, when Mexicans first were painting paintings of their own history of conquest by the Spanish, rather than paintings of Spanish history, that is a moment that might be hard to realize, that there was this whole colonial painting enterprise painting paintings of Spanish history, not from a Mexican perspective, being painted in Mexico City. And so once we open that up a little bit and we look at this 19th century painting by Felix Parra, again, one of Diego Rivera's teachers, he's painting a friar. And this is a very complicated situation where during the decimation of the indigenous population by smallpox and by basically slavery of working in the mines and by stripping away all the land, there were missionaries that were crucial to this domination by the Spanish. But some of those missionaries started to grapple with the death and destruction that they were seeing all around them. And so this is a painting by Parra of one of these friars, and the idea is talking about conquest as tragedy and the asynchronicity of medium and act of reclaiming nation identity, expressions of truth and anger, re-recording and rewriting history. And then on the right, you have a classic Diego fresco that's super interesting in that it's from this picture is of the one that's at the MoMA, which he started to make this series of portable plaster paintings, which goes against the idea in many ways of art for the people. If you subscribe to that needing a wall that can't be stripped and sold. So this is pretty much a copy from the Cuernavaca mural cycle that was sold to the MoMA. And so we have in that representation, we have an expression of anger and we have kind of an Aztec type jaguar, mythological, very important to the Mesoamericans, the jaguar concept, using a blade, maybe a stone blade or an obsidian blade for destroying the conquerors. And that's just a very different method of talking about anger and conquest, right? So I'm just showing these different painting modalities, and time has really sped up in terms of how we can represent things. We're just 50 years apart in these paintings. So then we move on to appropriation, and we have people like Picabia. This is late 1942, or Picasso 1921. We have a kind of a blend of neoclassicism, appropriation, parody, representation. It's kind of hard to put your finger on it, but you have Diego Rivera coming out of that a little bit, out of that European context when he represents figures. And so that's a sensitive thing to talk about. But are we meant to believe the figures as real, right? To what degree do we believe these are representations? When do we leave the representation? This touches on what I talked about from the very beginning, which is how long do we stay with an image or believe in it, right? There's that trope that Renaissance paintings were so real that a fly would land on it, or there's a competition and they're going to draw the curtain to decide who wins, and turns out the curtain is painted. This obsession with, in Western art history, with trompe l'oeil and being fooled retinally by an art object. And so what kind of pace is that compared to something that deals with a line towards abstraction from a realism concept where we decide to believe in the picture plane to something that is very abstracted and symbolic. And in between, you have all these different kinds of ways that you could represent the human form, and they all have a different pace for how long we believe it to be real versus kind of how intimate we relate to it versus it always being a picture of a thing. So that's something I would like to talk about in these talks also. And then I just have two more slides here to discuss. We have Tina Morari on the right, this incredible photographer who lived in Mexico, and she makes these photographs during the same time period as Diego is making murals. And I just want to point out that there are modern technologies existing during the time of Diego. And so when I say anachronistic appropriation of a fresco method, what we're saying is that he is choosing a mode of representation from the 1400s of Italy, and he's using that to represent a modernity of his time. And that's what anachronistic is, right? It's using something from outside of his time. And meanwhile, there was photography and video or not video, film. There were other ways to represent the world, and he chose this particular type of painting. And that's very interesting, and is really worth paying attention to, that he kind of dug far back to come up with a way of representing the people during this nation building time. So this painting on the left is from the Controller mural series, and it's as close as he gets, basically, explicitly anyhow, to representing something quite contemporary, which is, these are paintings of microscopic views. So he's painting what you can only see with a microscope. So we're leaving the general retinal world for something that is technologically advanced. But the thing is, he's not using the microscope to make the work. He's not using a camera. He's not using any new devices. He's still painting with fresco paint and paintings, and transferring drawings to a wall and having assistants and these kinds of things. So that's a very important point about Diego Rivera. And then lastly, we're dealing with revolutionary art. We're dealing with Mexico and communism and the very real political moment of the USA and communism. And, how do we approach these when Diego went to Russia, when Diego is a member of the Communist Party, when he has a mural taken down in New York because it has a representation of Lenin, things like this. So on the left, you have a wonderful photograph by Rodchenko, and on the right, you have a painting by Lisitsky. And these are moments of social artwork that have to do with things of Diego's political climate. But then again, he chose a very different way to represent Mexican history and his place in it. So that's the overarching ideas that I want to talk about with this series of lectures on Diego Rivera. So I'm really excited, and I hope that everyone enjoys it. Thank you.